The stagecoach arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late September of 1876, carrying a woman whose eyes held more ghosts than hope. Yancey Patterson stood on the dusty main street of Oroville, California, watching the weathered vehicle roll to a stop outside the Mercantile, his heart hammering against his ribs with an anxiety he had not felt since the war. He had written those letters with careful, deliberate honesty about his ranch, his solitary life in the foothills, and his need for a companion who could share the quiet beauty of a life built from nothing. The woman who descended from that stagecoach, however, was not the hopeful bride he had imagined from her neat, measured correspondence. Zelda Reeves moved like someone who expected the world to strike her at any moment. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back so severely, it seemed to pain her, and the high collar of her gray traveling dress was buttoned to her throat despite the warm autumn sun. When Yancey approached, removing his hat in a gesture his mother had drilled into him before she passed, Zelda flinched. It was subtle, barely a movement at all, but he saw it. Her hazel eyes darted to his hands, then to his face, searching for something he could not name. "Miss Reeves?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle the way he spoke to spooked horses. "Mr. Patterson." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she did not offer her hand. "I apologize for my appearance. The journey was difficult." That was a lie, or at least not the whole truth. Yancey had made the trek from Sacramento to Oroville countless times, and while uncomfortable, it did not put that particular haunted quality in a person's eyes. He picked up her single worn carpetbag, noting how light it was, and gestured toward his wagon. "The ranch is about an hour north, up in the foothills. I thought we might stop at the hotel here in town if you would like to rest first, or get something to eat." "No." The word came too quickly, too sharp. Then she seemed to catch herself, forcing her rigid shoulders to relax just slightly. "I mean, thank you, but I would prefer to go directly to your home if that is acceptable." Yancey nodded, studying her pale face. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of many sleepless nights, and her hands, though gloved, trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirts. Something had happened to this woman, something that had carved out pieces of her and left only this fragile shell. He had expected a partner, perhaps even a friend. What he had received was a broken bird who looked like she might shatter if he spoke too loudly. The ride to the ranch passed in near silence. Yancey tried a few times to make conversation, pointing out landmarks, mentioning the neighbors who lived scattered throughout the hills, but Zelda only nodded, her eyes fixed on her folded hands. She sat as far from him on the wagon bench as physics would allow, and when the wheel hit a rut and jolted her toward him, she gasped and pulled away so violently she nearly tumbled off the other side. "Easy there," Yancey said, reaching out instinctively to steady her, but she jerked from his touch like it burned. "Please do not touch me," she whispered, and there was such raw terror in those 5 words that Yancey felt something crack in his chest. He pulled his hand back and kept his eyes on the road. "I am sorry. I will not do so again without your permission." She said nothing, but he heard her breathing slowly return to normal. The Patterson Ranch sprawled across 200 acres of foothill country, where golden grass rolled between scattered oaks, and the distant Sierra Nevada peaks painted the eastern horizon. The house itself was modest but well built, a simple frame structure with a wide porch and windows that caught the afternoon light. Yancey had spent the past 2 weeks making it as presentable as possible, scrubbing floors, washing curtains, even picking wildflowers for the table. Looking at it now through Zelda's eyes, he wondered if she saw only another prison. He helped her down from the wagon, careful not to touch her, and carried her bag to the porch. "I will show you to your room. I have been sleeping in the barn since I knew you were coming." I thought you might prefer privacy." Zelda turned to him then, and for the first time he saw something other than fear in her expression, confusion perhaps, or disbelief. "The barn." "Yes, madam, I fixed up the tack room. It is actually quite comfortable, and I am accustomed to rising early to tend the animals anyway." He opened the front door and gestured her inside. "This house is yours. I will not enter without your invitation." She stood in the doorway, her frame silhouetted against the warm interior light, and he saw her shoulders begin to shake. For a terrible moment he thought she might collapse, but then he realized she was crying. Silent tears tracked down her pale cheeks, and she pressed a hand to her mouth as if to hold back sobs. Yancey felt helpless, standing there with his hat in his hands. "Miss Reeves, I did not mean to upset you." "No one has ever," she began, her voice breaking. "No one has ever been kind without wanting something in return." The words hung between them like smoke. Yancey wanted to tell her that kindness should not be a currency, that basic human decency was not something to be bartered, but he sensed that words would mean nothing to her right now. Instead, he simply nodded. "I will be in the barn if you need anything. There is food in the kitchen, firewood by the stove. Please make yourself at home." He left her there, standing in the doorway of a stranger's house, and walked back to the barn feeling like he had just made either the best or worst decision of his life. That first night, Yancey lay on his cot in the tack room, listening to the horses shuffle in their stalls and wondering what demons pursued Zelda Reeves into such darkness. He had seen broken men after the war, soldiers who jumped at sudden sounds and could not bear to be confined in small spaces. His own brother had returned from Gettysburg with a tremor in his hands that never quite went away. But there was something different about Zelda's fear, something more personal and immediate. When dawn broke over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Yancey rose and went about his morning routine. He fed the horses and the handful of cattle he kept, milked the cow, collected eggs from the chickens. He was halfway through mucking the stalls when he noticed Zelda standing in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the morning light. "Good morning," he said, leaning on his pitchfork. "Did you sleep well?" "No." She seemed to realize how that sounded and added, "But that is not due to any fault of the accommodations. The bed is very comfortable. Thank you." She was still wearing the same gray dress from yesterday, and her hair remained in that severe style, but her face looked slightly less drawn. She held a basket in her hands, gripping it like a lifeline. "I made breakfast," she said. "I thought you might be hungry." It was such a simple gesture, but Yancey found himself smiling. "That is very kind of you. Let me just finish here and wash up." They ate on the porch, watching the sun climb higher and burn off the morning mist that clung to the valleys. Zelda had made eggs and biscuits, both prepared with a competence that spoke of long practice. They ate in silence for a while before Yancey worked up the courage to speak. "Miss Reeves, I want you to know that I have no expectations of you. When I sent for a mail-order bride, I was hoping for a companion, someone to share this life with. But I understand that you might need time to adjust. We can proceed at whatever pace feels right to you." Zelda set down her fork carefully. "What if I can never be what you need? Then we will figure something else out. You are not a prisoner here. If you want to leave, I will take you back to Sacramento and pay for your passage to wherever you want to go. Just like that. Just like that." She studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for the lie, the trap, the hidden cruelty. When she found none, something in her seemed to shift just slightly. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile possibility of it. "I was married before," she said quietly, staring out at the golden hills. "My husband was not a kind man." Yancey waited, giving her space to continue or not as she chose. He died 6 months ago, fell from his horse while drunk and broke his neck. Everyone in St. Louis said what a tragedy it was, what a loss. I smiled and played the grieving widow, but inside I felt nothing but relief. She turned to look at him, and he saw shame and defiance warring in her expression. "Does that shock you?" "No," Yancey said honestly. "If he was cruel to you, then I imagine his death felt like escape. He was more than cruel." The words came out flat, emotionless, as if she had locked away all feeling to survive. "He enjoyed causing pain. He said it was his right as my husband, that I belonged to him to do with as he pleased. For 3 years I endured, I prayed. I tried to be better, quieter, more obedient. Nothing was ever enough." Yancey felt rage building in his chest, hot and fierce, but he kept his voice calm. "I am sorry you suffered that way. No one deserves such treatment. After he died, his debts came due. He had gambled away everything, borrowed against money he did not have. His creditors wanted payment and I had nothing. Someone suggested I might find a new husband out west, someone who did not know my history, so I answered your advertisement." She looked down at her hands. "I should have told you the truth in my letters. I should have warned you that I am damaged goods." "You are not damaged," Yancey said firmly. "You are hurt, and that is different. Hurt can heal, can it?" There was such desperate hope in those 2 words that it nearly broke him. "I believe so. But it takes time and patience and safety. I can offer you all 3 if you will let me." Over the following weeks, they developed a careful routine. Yancey continued to sleep in the barn, rising before dawn to tend the animals and work the land. Zelda kept house, cooking meals that grew increasingly elaborate as she gained access to the well-stocked pantry and root cellar. They ate together twice a day, breakfast and supper, and slowly, cautiously, they began to talk. Yancey told her about growing up in Kansas, about coming west after the war because he could not bear to farm the same land where his father had worked himself into an early grave. He spoke of his mother's gentle wisdom, his brother's war-haunted eyes, the sweet relief of building something entirely his own in this wild foothill country. Zelda shared pieces of her past like fragments of broken glass, careful and painful. She had grown up in a strict household where girls were taught their only value lay in obedience and marriage. Her father had sold her, essentially, to the first man who offered a decent bride price. She had been 17 and terrified, and her husband had been 32 and cruel from the very first night. One evening in late October, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of fire, Zelda said something that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "You should not be sleeping in the barn. Winter is coming and it will get cold." Yancey shrugged. "I have plenty of blankets and the horses keep the space warm enough." "It is not right. This is your home. I am the intruder." "You are not an intruder. You are my wife, at least on paper." They had gone to the county office in Oroville 3 days after her arrival and made it legal. Yancey had wanted to ensure she had rights to the property and his name, protection in case something happened to him. Zelda had signed the register with a shaking hand, and he had promised her again that the paper changed nothing unless she wanted it to. "The house has 2 bedrooms," Zelda said carefully, not looking at him. "You could sleep in the second one. It seems foolish for you to freeze in the barn when there is a perfectly good bed going unused." It was an olive branch, tentatively offered. Yancey accepted it with equal care. "If you are certain you would be comfortable with that arrangement." "I am certain I would feel less guilty," she said, and there was the faintest hint of humor in her voice, the first he had heard. So Yancey moved back into the house, taking the smaller bedroom at the back while Zelda kept the larger front room. That first night, He lay awake listening to the old house settle around him, aware of her presence just down the hall. It felt both intimate and entirely chaste, like they were two strangers learning to share space without colliding. The rhythm of ranch life suited them both. There was always work to be done, which gave structure to their days and limited the awkward silences. Yancey taught Zelda to ride, starting her on his gentlest mare and walking beside her through the Golden Hills. She was terrified at first, rigid and pale-knuckled, but gradually she began to relax into the horse's swaying gait. "My husband used to threaten to tie me to his horse and drag me through the streets if I displeased him," she told Yancey one afternoon as they walked the horses along a ridge overlooking the valley. "I have been afraid of them ever since." "Horses are honest creatures," Yancey said. "They do not lie or manipulate. If you treat them with respect and kindness, they will return it, unlike some people." Zelda reached down to stroke her mare's neck, a gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. "She is very sweet. Her name is Daisy. She is getting old now, but she has been a good friend to me over the years." "You talk to her when you are alone," Yancey grinned. "All the time. She is an excellent listener and never interrupts." That earned him something he had not heard before, Zelda's laugh. It was rusty and uncertain, as if she had forgotten how the mechanism worked, but it was genuine. The sound of it made something warm bloom in Yancey's chest. Winter arrived in earnest in December, bringing cold rains that turned the roads to mud and kept them close to the house. Yancey spent the short days repairing tack, mending fences, and chopping endless cords of firewood. Zelda threw herself into domestic projects, sewing new curtains, knitting socks and scarves, baking bread that filled the house with warmth and the scent of yeast. They began spending their evenings by the fire, Yancey reading aloud from the handful of books he owned while Zelda worked on her sewing. Sometimes she would stop him to ask about a word or phrase, and they would end up in long conversations about everything and nothing. He learned that she was far more educated than her circumstances suggested, that she had a quick mind and a dry wit when she felt safe enough to show it. One evening, as sleet rattled against the windows and the fire crackled cheerfully, Zelda set down her mending and looked at Yancey with an expression he could not quite read. "Why did you never marry before? You are not an old man, and you seem perfectly capable of attracting a wife without resorting to advertisements in newspapers." Yancey considered the question, marking his place in the book with his finger. "I suppose I was waiting for the right person. I have met plenty of women, but none who seemed suited to this life. Ranching is hard work and lonely. It takes a particular kind of person to thrive here. And you thought a desperate mail-order bride would be that person." There was no accusation in her tone, only curiosity. Yancey answered honestly. "I thought someone choosing this life deliberately, even out of necessity, might appreciate it more than someone born into it. I also liked your letters. You wrote about wanting peace and space to breathe. That told me you understood what I was offering." "Peace and space to breathe," Zelda repeated softly. "That is exactly what I needed, though I did not realize it when I wrote those words. Have you found it here?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I am beginning to," she finally said. "For the first time in years, I do not wake up afraid. That is something." As winter deepened, so did their connection. It happened in small increments, barely noticeable day to day, but unmistakable when Yancey looked back over the months. Zelda stopped flinching when he moved too quickly. She began sitting closer to him at meals, their elbows occasionally brushing. She asked questions about the ranch work, and sometimes accompanied him on simple tasks, holding tools or helping to feed the animals. In January, a terrible storm blew through. howling like a living thing and piling snow against the north side of the house. Yancey woke in the dead of night to a crash from the front of the house and stumbled from his room to find Zelda standing in the hallway, wrapped in a quilt and shaking. "The wind blew the shutter loose," he said, peering out the window at the offending piece of wood banging against the house. "I will have to secure it before it breaks." "You cannot go out in this," Zelda protested. "You will freeze." "I will be quick." He pulled on his coat and boots and headed for the door. The wind nearly tore it from his hands when he opened it. Snow stung his face and immediately began working its way into every gap in his clothing. He fought his way around to the window, found the loose shutter, and wrestled it back into place, securing it with numb fingers. By the time he made it back inside, his teeth were chattering and his hands were white. Zelda took one look at him and sprang into action. She pulled him close to the fire, stripped off his wet coat, and began briskly rubbing warmth back into his hands. It was the first time she had deliberately touched him, and she seemed to realize it at the same moment he did. She froze, her hands wrapped around his. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I should have asked." "It is all right," Yancey managed through his chattering teeth. "You are helping. I am grateful." She did not pull away, and after a moment she continued her ministrations, working warmth back into his frozen fingers. They were standing so close he could smell the lavender soap she favored, could see the firelight dancing in her hazel eyes. "You could have died out there," she said, and there was something fierce in her voice. "Over a stupid shutter. I am tougher than I look." "Clearly not tough enough to come in from a blizzard with all your fingers intact." But she was almost smiling as she said it, and she did not let go of his hands even after they had warmed. They stood there for a long moment, the wind howling outside and the fire crackling beside them, hands intertwined. Then Zelda seemed to come back to herself. She released him and stepped back, wrapping her quilt more tightly around her shoulders. "You should change into dry clothes and get some rest," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "So should you." But neither of them moved. They stood there in the firelight, and Yancey felt something shift between them, some invisible wall beginning to crack. Spring came slowly to the California foothills, green grass pushing through the snow in patches, wildflowers beginning to dot the meadows with color. Yancey watched Zelda bloom along with the landscape. She smiled more readily now, laughed at his jokes, even teased him occasionally about his terrible cooking or his habit of talking to the animals. She had taken over the small vegetable garden behind the house, spending hours on her knees in the dirt, coaxing life from the earth. Yancey would watch her from the barn sometimes, seeing the peace that settled over her when she was working with growing things. Her severe hairstyle had softened into a looser braid, and she had taken to wearing simpler dresses in lighter colors. She looked younger, lighter, like someone learning to carry joy instead of just enduring weight. One warm April afternoon, Yancey returned from checking the northern pasture to find Zelda waiting on the porch with a basket and a determined expression. "We are going on a picnic," she announced. "We are." "Yes. It is a beautiful day. I have made fried chicken and biscuits, and you have been working yourself to exhaustion. We are going to that spot by the creek you showed me last month, and we are going to do nothing but enjoy the sunshine." Yancey could not help but grin. "Yes, madam." They rode out together, Zelda on Daisy and Yancey on his gelding, picking their way down to a spot where the creek widened into a clear pool. Wildflowers carpeted the banks, and oak trees provided dappled shade. It was, Yancey had always thought, the most beautiful spot on the entire ranch. They spread a blanket and ate Zelda's excellent cooking, talking and laughing as the water burbled past. After the meal, Zelda lay back on the blanket, staring up through the oak branches at the brilliant blue sky. "I never imagined I could feel this way," she said quietly. What way? Happy. Content, safe. She turned her head to look at him. You gave me that, Yancey. You gave me my life back. He lay down beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. You did that yourself. I just provided the space. You provided much more than space. Her voice was thick with emotion. You provided patience and kindness and respect. You treated me like a person when I had forgotten that was what I was. They lay there in silence for a while, listening to the creek and the birds and the wind in the oak leaves. Then, Zelda did something that made Yancey's heart stop. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. I think I am ready, she whispered. Ready for what? To be your wife. Truly. In all the ways that matter. Yancey rolled onto his side to face her, needing to see her eyes to be certain this was what she really wanted. Zelda, there is no rush. We have all the time in the world, I know. But I do not want to wait any more. I am tired of letting fear control my life. I am tired of letting him control my life, even from the grave. She reached up with her free hand to touch his face, and her fingers trembled only slightly. I care for you, Yancey, more than I thought I could ever care for anyone again, and I think you care for me too. I do, he said, his voice rough. I have for a while now. Then kiss me, please. Help me remember what it feels like to be touched with gentleness. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and brushed his lips against hers. It was the softest kiss imaginable, barely more than a whisper of contact, but he felt her breath catch. He started to pull back, but she followed him, deepening the kiss with a hunger that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zelda was crying. But she was also smiling, really smiling in a way that lit up her entire face. That was nothing like before, she said, wonder in her voice. That was beautiful. Yancey wiped away her tears with his thumb. You are beautiful. They stayed by the creek until the sun began its descent, talking and kissing and simply being close. When they finally rode home in the deepening twilight, everything had changed. They were no longer two strangers sharing a house, no longer broken pieces existing in parallel. They were something new, something neither of them had quite expected. They were partners. They were friends. They were falling in love. That night, Zelda did not retreat to her separate room. She stood in the hallway between their two doors, looking at Yancey with a mixture of nervousness and determination. Will you sleep in my room tonight? Just sleep. I want to know what it feels like to share a bed with someone I trust. They lay together in the darkness, Zelda curled against Yancey's chest, his arms wrapped carefully around her. She trembled at first, old fears rising up despite her best intentions, but gradually she relaxed. Yancey stroked her hair and murmured reassurances until he felt her breathing even out in sleep. He lay awake for a long time, listening to her breathe, feeling the warmth of her body against his. He had loved before, brief, passionate affairs that burned bright and faded fast. But this was different. This was a love built on foundation stones of patience and respect, a love that had grown slowly in the spaces between words. It was deeper than anything he had known and infinitely more precious because of what it had cost them both to reach this point. Summer arrived with its golden heat, and with it came a new phase of their relationship. Zelda grew bolder, initiating touches and kisses, learning to trust her own desires. They made love for the first time on a warm June night, windows open to catch the breeze, and Zelda cried afterward, but from relief and joy rather than pain. I did not know it could be like that, she whispered against his shoulder. I did not know my body could feel pleasure instead of just pain. Your body is your own, Yancey told her. What we share because we both choose it. That will never change. They fell into the easy intimacy of a long married couple, though they had been together less than a year. They worked the ranch side by side, Zelda proving herself as capable with a horse as any ranch hand. She helped with the cattle drives to market, rode fence lines checking for breaks, even assisted with difficult births when the cows were calving. In August, neighbors came from miles around for a barn raising. The Wilsons had lost their structure to a fire, and the community gathered to rebuild it in a single day. Zelda threw herself into providing food for the workers, organizing the other women, laughing and chatting as if she had been part of this community all her life. Yancey watched her from across the construction site, saw her smile at something Mrs. Henderson said, saw her brush flour from her apron with casual comfort. She caught him looking and winked, a gesture so playful and unexpected that he nearly dropped the beam he was carrying. "Your wife seems happy," his neighbor Thomas Wilson commented, following Yancey's gaze. "She is," Yancey agreed. "We both are. You are lucky. Not everyone finds that kind of partnership, I know." That night, as they lay in bed exhausted from the long day, Zelda said something that had clearly been on her mind. "I want to have a baby." Yancey propped himself up on one elbow to look at her. "Are you certain? That is a big step." "I am certain. For years I dreaded the possibility of bringing a child into my first marriage. I could not bear the thought of my child suffering as I suffered. But with you, everything is different. I want to create something good, something that comes from love instead of obligation." "Then we will try," Yancey said, kissing her forehead. "And whatever happens, we will face it together." Autumn painted the hills in shades of gold and russet, and Zelda's belly began to swell with new life. She glowed with it, despite the morning sickness that plagued her first few months. Yancey fussed over her constantly, trying to take on her share of the work, but she stubbornly refused to be treated like an invalid. "Women have been having babies since the dawn of time," she reminded him, hauling water from the well despite his protests. "I am perfectly capable of doing my normal work." "I know you are capable. I just want to help." She softened, setting down the bucket to cup his face in her hands. "You do help, every single day, but you need to let me be strong too. I spent years being told I was weak and helpless. I need to prove to myself that I am not." So Yancey backed off, though he kept a watchful eye on her, ready to step in if she truly needed him. He watched her strength with awe, this woman who had arrived so broken and had rebuilt herself into someone fierce and capable. Winter returned, and with it came Zelda's time. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through an entire night and into the following day. Yancey held her hand through it all, wiping her face with cool cloths, letting her squeeze his fingers until they went numb. Mrs. Henderson, who had assisted at dozens of births, remained calm and encouraging even as the hours stretched on. Finally, as the winter sun was setting on the second day, a baby's cry filled the little house. Yancey felt tears streaming down his face as Mrs. Henderson placed a squalling, red-faced infant in Zelda's arms. "A boy," the older woman announced with satisfaction. "A healthy, strong boy." Zelda looked down at her son with an expression of such profound love and wonder that Yancey felt his heart might burst. The baby had a shock of dark hair in his mother's eyes, and when he wrapped his tiny hand around Yancey's finger, Yancey was completely lost. "What should we call him?" Zelda asked, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "I was thinking Thomas, after your father." Zelda's eyes widened. She had told him once in passing about her father who had died when she was young, the only man who had ever been truly kind to her. "You remembered." "Of course I remembered." She kissed him, heedless of Mrs. Henderson's presence, and whispered, "Thomas Patterson. It is perfect." Life with an infant was exhausting and chaotic and utterly wonderful. Thomas was a demanding baby, crying often and sleeping in short bursts, but both Yancey and Zelda were besotted with him. They took turns walking him through the house at night, singing lullabies, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes. Yancey discovered a capacity for love he had not known he possessed. He had loved Zelda deeply, but this was different, fiercer. This tiny person was completely dependent on them, completely trusting. The weight of that responsibility was staggering and glorious all at once. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Yancey expanded the herd, bought more land, built a larger barn. Zelda's garden became legendary in the area, producing vegetables in such abundance that she began selling the surplus at the market in Oroville. They were building something together, a life of substance and meaning. On Thomas's third birthday, as they watched their son chase chickens around the yard with gleeful determination, Zelda leaned against Yancey's shoulder and sighed with contentment. "You ever think about how different things might have been?" she asked. "Different how?" "If I had not answered your advertisement, if you had chosen someone else." Yancey wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "I try not to think about that. It is too terrible to contemplate. I almost did not come, you know. I wrote the letter accepting your proposal, but I stood in front of the post office for an hour before I could bring myself to mail it. I was so afraid. What changed your mind?" "I realized I had two choices: stay in St. Louis and slowly suffocate under the weight of my past, or take a chance on something unknown. The unknown seemed less frightening than the known, which tells you how bad things were. I am glad you were brave. I am glad you were patient." She turned in his arms to face him. "You saved my life, Yancey Patterson. You gave me time and space to heal, and you never demanded more than I could give. You loved me back to life. You did the hard work yourself. I just held the door open. We saved each other," she said firmly. "You were lonely too, remember? You needed companionship as much as I needed safety. We built this life together, piece by piece." Thomas came running up then, his chubby legs pumping, his face flushed with exertion. "Papa, Mama, I caught a feather. Look." He held up a chicken feather with such pride that both parents had to smother their laughter. Yancey scooped his son into his arms, and Zelda wrapped her arms around them both, the three of them standing there in the golden afternoon light, complete. The years flowed by like water, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. They added 2 more children to their family, a daughter named Charlotte when Thomas was 5, and another son, Samuel, 3 years after that. The house that had once seemed so empty now rang with children's laughter and the chaos of family life. Thomas grew tall and serious, with his mother's quick mind and his father's steady temperament. Charlotte was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, always climbing trees and catching frogs despite Zelda's attempts to interest her in more ladylike pursuits. Samuel was the baby, sweet-natured and affectionate, always ready with hugs and sticky kisses. Zelda had become a pillar of the community, known for her kindness and her wisdom. Women came to her with their troubles, and she listened with the empathy of someone who had walked through her own darkness and emerged on the other side. She never spoke of her first marriage, but somehow people sensed that she understood suffering in a profound way. Yancey watched his wife transform over the years from that broken, terrified woman who had stepped off the stagecoach into someone radiant with confidence and joy. She wore her hair down now, letting it fall in soft waves around her face. She laughed freely, loved fiercely, and moved through the world with the assurance of someone who knew her own worth. On their 10th anniversary, Yancey surprised her with a trip to San Francisco. They left the children with the Hendersons and took the train to the city, staying in a fine hotel and dining in restaurants where they used more forks than seemed strictly necessary. Zelda was wide-eyed at the bustle and noise, the grand buildings and crowded streets. "It is wonderful to visit," she said as they stood on the waterfront watching ships come and go, "but I am glad we do not live here. Give me our quiet hills any day." No regrets about choosing a rancher over a city gentleman. She turned to him, eyes shining with emotion. "Not a single one. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Yancey Patterson. You and the children and the life we have built. I would not trade it for anything." He kissed her there on the waterfront, heedless of the scandalized looks from passers-by, and felt the same rush of love he had felt that first time by the creek all those years ago. Some things, it seemed, only grew stronger with time. They returned home to find the children had conspired with Mrs. Henderson to bake a lopsided cake and fashion decorations from wildflowers and colored paper. The house was a mess, and Thomas had somehow managed to get frosting in his hair, but the welcome was so enthusiastic and heartfelt that Zelda cried happy tears. "I miss you, Mama," Charlotte said, wrapping herself around her mother's legs. "Do not ever go away again." "I promise," Zelda said, scooping up her daughter. "This is where I belong." As the children grew older, Yancey made sure to pass along not just the practical skills of ranching, but also the values that had guided his life. He taught them that strength meant protecting those weaker than yourself, that kindness cost nothing but meant everything, that every living creature deserved respect and care. Zelda added her own lessons, teaching the children that healing was possible no matter how deep the wounds, that the past did not have to define the future, that love was a choice you made every day. She was careful never to spoil them, but equally careful to make sure they knew they were valued and cherished. Thomas was 18 and ready to take over more responsibility on the ranch when Zelda found the lump in her breast. She said nothing at first, hoping it would go away on its own, but it only grew larger. Finally, she told Yancey, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I need to see a doctor. There is something wrong." The doctor in Oroville was grave. He recommended she see a specialist in Sacramento, someone with more experience in these matters. The specialist was equally somber. Surgery was possible, he said, but there were no guarantees. The disease might already have spread. Yancey held Zelda's hand through all of it, the consultations, the surgery, the long weeks of recovery. She faced it with the same courage she had shown in rebuilding her life all those years ago, but he could see the fear lurking behind her brave face. The surgery seemed successful at first. Zelda recovered slowly, regaining her strength, returning to her normal activities. They allowed themselves to hope that they had caught it in time, that they would have many more years together. But a year later, the disease returned with a vengeance. This time, the doctor was blunt. There was nothing more they could do. She had months, perhaps a year if she was lucky. Yancey felt his world crumbling. After everything they had survived, everything they had built together, it seemed impossibly cruel that this was how their story would end. But Zelda, as always, was stronger than circumstances. "I am not afraid to die," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, something they had done thousands of times before. "I have had more happiness in these years with you than I ever dreamed possible. I have loved and been loved. I have brought children into the world and watched them grow. I have lived, truly lived, and that is more than I once thought I would ever have." "I am not ready to lose you," Yancey said, his voice breaking. "I know, and I am not ready to leave. But we do not always get to choose these things." She took his hand, her grip still strong despite her illness. "Promise me something, anything. Promise me you will not spend the rest of your life grieving. I want you to remember our joy, not just our ending. I want you to laugh and love and live fully. Can you do that for me? I can try." "Good." She leaned her head on his shoulder. And promise me you will make sure the children know how much I loved them, that even at the end my greatest pride was being their mother. They know. But I will remind them every day." Zelda lived for 9 more months, and they were both the longest and shortest months of Yancey's life. He watched her grow weaker, watched the disease slowly claim her body even as her spirit remained indomitable. She spent her good days with the children, telling them stories, teaching Charlotte to sew, helping Samuel with his letters. She spent her evenings with Yancey, talking about everything and nothing, remembering their life together. On a warm spring evening with wildflowers blooming outside the window and her family gathered around her bed, Zelda slipped away. Her last words were to Yancey, whispered so softly only he could hear them. "Thank you for loving me whole." The grief was overwhelming at first, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. Yancey moved through the days in a haze, doing what needed to be done because the ranch and the children required it, but feeling hollowed out inside. The house felt too big without her laughter, the bed too empty without her warmth. But slowly, gradually, he began to heal. He remembered his promise to her, to honor their joy rather than drown in grief. He found himself smiling at memories instead of crying over them. He told the children stories about their mother, keeping her alive in the tales of her bravery and kindness and love. Thomas took over more of the ranch work, growing into a fine young man who combined his mother's intelligence with his father's steady nature. Charlotte became a teacher at the local school, shaping young minds with patience and creativity. Samuel showed an aptitude for music, playing the fiddle at local dances and filling the house with melody. The years passed, and Yancey grew old. His hair turned silver, his back bent from a lifetime of hard work, but his mind remained sharp and his heart remained full. He never remarried. What he had shared with Zelda was too precious, too unique to try to replicate. On his 70th birthday, surrounded by his children and a passel of grandchildren, Yancey sat on the porch of the old house and thought about the journey that had brought him here. He thought about a terrified woman stepping off a stagecoach, about the long, slow work of building trust and love, about the family they had created together. Thomas came to sit beside him, his oldest son now a man of 45 with silver threading his own dark hair. "What are you thinking about, Papa?" "Your mother," Yancey said. "I was thinking about the day she arrived. She was so broken, so afraid. I had no idea if I could help her, if we could build anything together. But we did. You gave her a good life. We gave each other a good life." Yancey smiled at his son. "That is the secret, you know. Love is not about one person saving the other. It is about two people choosing each other every day and building something together. Your mother arrived broken, and I spent years helping her heal. But she healed me too, in ways I did not even know I needed. I hope I can find what you two had," Thomas said quietly. "You will. Just be patient and be kind and remember that the best things take time." Yancey lived 5 more years, long enough to see all his children happily settled, long enough to hold great-grandchildren in his arms. When his time finally came, he went peacefully in his sleep, in the bed he had shared with Zelda for so many years. They buried him next to her on the hill overlooking the ranch, under an oak tree where they used to sit on summer evenings. The headstones were simple. Zelda Reeves Patterson, beloved wife and mother, and Yancey Patterson, beloved husband and father. But between them, the children had placed a small stone marker with a simple inscription. Together they built a life of love. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story. But they all knew where it had started, with a broken woman and a patient man who had shown her what love could be. They told the story to their children and grandchildren, a tale of hope and healing that transcended time. In the end, It was not a story about rescue or salvation. It was a story about two people who met at the lowest points of their lives and chose to build something beautiful together. It was about patience and kindness, about the slow, steady work of healing, about love that grew from broken pieces into something whole and strong. Zelda had arrived broken, carrying scars that ran deep and wounds that seemed beyond healing. But Yancey had not tried to fix her quickly or force her into a mold. He had simply given her space and time and unwavering respect, letting her heal at her own pace. And in that space, in that safety, she had bloomed into someone strong and whole and radiantly alive. And Yancey, lonely and isolated in his mountain ranch, had been healed as well. Zelda had taught him about resilience and courage, about the strength it took to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. She had filled his life with laughter and love, with children and family and purpose. They had spent a lifetime putting each other back together, piece by careful piece, building something far stronger than either could have created alone. And in the end, that was the greatest love story of all. The wildflowers still bloomed on that hillside every spring, covering the graves in a carpet of gold and purple and blue. The creek still burbled in the valley below, and the oak trees still rustled in the warm wind. The land remembered them, the house remembered them, and the family they had built carried their legacy forward. Somewhere in the spaces between, if you listened carefully on quiet evenings, you might hear an echo of laughter, or the soft murmur of voices talking late into the night, or the contented silence of two people who had found exactly what they needed in each other. It was a love that had started with a mail-order bride and a lonely cowboy, and it had grown into something eternal, something that time and death could not diminish. In the end, they had both arrived broken in their own ways. And together, slowly and patiently, with kindness and respect and unwavering love, they had spent a lifetime putting each other back together. It was not a grand, dramatic gesture, but a quiet daily choice, made over and over again, to see each other clearly, to honor each other's pain, and to build something beautiful from the broken pieces. That was the true Wild West love story, not of conquest or domination, but of two people learning to trust again, to love again, to live again. And it was perfect.